Okay, so welcome to our little webinar. We have myself and Justin in the house, ready to talk about our new creation, the textbook of Integrative Sport and Exercise Nutrition. So we are very proud of our creation, and it should actually be out this week. We've been told by the publishers this is the publishing week, so I'm a bit disappointed we don't have it in our hand just yet, but it'll hopefully be pretty soon. What we're going to do tonight is just introduce the textbook, throw around a few ideas that we used to create the textbook, and also give you an opportunity to ask us some questions. Like our usual webinar style, Justin and I will talk a bit. We're not going to use many slides, so it'll be more a kind of podcast conversation, but then we'll allocate the last roughly 15 minutes that you can come on and ask some questions. So this is the textbook cover. I'm very proud that we didn't actually use AI to create the images in this day and age. This is actually my wife Rachel doing a deadlift in her gym, photographed by my good childhood friend who's a professional food photographer. And the funny thing about this is we're trying to match up the reds from the raspberries, pomegranates, Rachel's t-shirt, and also the plates on the barbell. The only red plates in the gym were 25 kilos. So Rach had quite a hard workout to actually get this photo shoot done. So I'm gonna share and unshare the screen because we don't need to always have a slide up. And when we get to something that's appropriate to talk about, I'll bring it back up. So we'll just go to introductions at the moment. I'll introduce myself, Justin will introduce himself, and we'll go into different elements of the book. So my background was in exercise physiology originally, and I then went into nutritional therapy. And I was an athlete. I was a runner, middle distance runner. So basically, for the last 20 years, I've been trying to apply the principles of integrative nutrition from things like nutritional therapy and functional medicine across to the world of sport and exercise, which is quite a harsh space. You know, it's a hard space. You've got your elite athletes who put an incredible amount of physical and physiological stress through their body, and they need to be supported and nourished to do that. And then you get your recreational athletes, and now more than ever, because things like marathons and Ironmans and big trail events, CrossFit, HIIT events, military style fitness, they're all incredibly popular. And then you get people who are working 40 hours a week and family commitments, and they're not sleeping enough and they're not nourishing themselves enough, but they're trying to put themselves through big workouts. So there's a big array, and hence we put the word exercise into our title, Integrative Sport and Exercise Nutrition, because it's not just about these elite athletes, which I think has been the cornerstone of the sports nutrition world so far. Okay, Justin, passing over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself? Oh, and also tell everyone why you took up the challenge that I gave you of writing the textbook.
Oh my God, what an introduction. So, hi everyone. So for those that don't know me, my name's Justin. I'm a professor of nutritional physiology at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. My background's actually more to do with sports science. I did my first degree in that domain, and then kind of ventured more into nutrition as my journey unfolded. And one of the reasons that I got into nutrition is because I used to be a personal trainer after my first degree. And one day I had two huge bodybuilders come into the gym promoting, this is back in the long time ago, but we had two big bodybuilders that came into the gym promoting personalized nutrition. Even back then, that was nearly kind of 3, 4 decades ago, no, 3 decades ago. Um, And I got really fascinated by how nutrition has the power to really transform the body and more importantly, help the body perform. And at the time, I was more interested in performance from an exercise perspective. And then my journey kind of unfolded into more sport nutrition, and particularly my time working within the Olympic Medical Center, I got to see some very high level athletes. And then my journey kind of took a sort of a split beyond that. So I ended up doing work in more medical related nutrition and metabolic syndrome, whilst simultaneously still having interest in recovery nutrition and performance nutrition. I was also then very fortunate to work with some very high profile teams in professional sport. So I've got to see individuals and teams from novices all the way through to high performance athletes. And it's very interesting to observe how they do things in the real world versus what you see in the literature in the sports domain. So to answer the question, I'm now a professor. I have a split role. I work in a university as supervising PhD students, but I also have a research role and a management role within a nutrition company. Um, and the reason I got into this book is when Ian first approached me, which feels like an eternity ago. He was, if you know Ian, you'll know him very well. He's one of these people that is very calm, but also very persistent. Um, and he asked me many times, do you want to write this book? And I really see an important need for this book. And at the time, I was doing a big research project that I just couldn't really commit to it. And he kept on asking, and I kept on thinking. And then it was one day I was in my office and I picked up one of my old nutrition textbooks, and I was kind of it coincided with a time when I went to a particular conference where I felt like I didn't get an awful lot back out of that conference. It was the same old stuff heard for the previous decade, and also there was nothing really new or translational or applied. There were some good ideas, but often it was just not really translated. And so I thought for about 4 months before I turned around to him and said, "Yeah, we should really do this book because I can see some validity here." And that's what's led us to this journey, which is building the kind of bridge between science and practice. And that's what we're trying to achieve with this book, at least in part, and certainly as a starting point for the future of sports nutrition.
And that's a good intro to the textbook as well. Kind of we played the role of Justin the academic and me the practitioner in this book, but we both have a duality in both spheres. But also Justin's idea right at the start was to bring people into each chapter to strengthen the credibility, but also the depth of experience coming into it, knowledge and experience, because it's not just about this dry academic knowledge that's often theoretical. It's about, well, what actually happens in practice and how can we use this stuff? And pulling from the experience of practitioners, because the domain of sports nutrition, just like many other fields, is mostly from the research lab. It's academics that write the textbooks. So we wanted to shift that a little bit. So every single chapter has at least one academic and at least one practitioner in it, plus the two of us editing it. So what... Before we go into the slides, Justin, are there any other aspects of the textbook you think we've missed that need to be sort of brought in?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is, we're not dismissing the history of nutrition textbooks before us, and a lot of them have been superbly well constructed and contribute a lot to the domain. And of course, and most of them are being used in current practice. What this book tries to do is bring the word integrative into play. And in the book, we define it as in a number of parameters. So the first thing is when we talk about integrative, we talk about the complexity of the human body. So many athletes don't think about this. Many practitioners don't think about this. And it's very much like we'll just give our athletes energy or carbs or proteins. And whilst that is correct at a simplistic level and a fundamental day-to-day level, we need to delve deeper into what the nutrients are doing for our body. So in the first half of the book, you'll see there's several chapters that are all dedicated to trying to explore these different systems of the body, the gut being an obvious one. And then the interconnection between the gut and other parts of the body and vice versa, the crosstalk between systems. And so if you influence one, you influence another, and we'll come on to that in a bit. And then it's also integrated from in part the systems, but also what nutrition is actually doing for us. When you consume your food, how's it digested? How does it get into the body? What is it doing for us? And also integrative in the sense of sharing knowledge and information. I've been privileged to work in many different sports, but also different areas, and it fascinates me how you see almost poor communication between disciplines and within discipline. So I have seen, particularly in the nutrition world, um, differences of opinion, which is fine, but also kind of poor connection or communication even within and between disciplines. So if you're working in a multidisciplinary arena, like a team sport, for example, you have to have the ability to share your information with different disciplines and coordinate that. Um, so it was kind of integrated from a variety of perspectives. And one of the things we wanted to try and do is kind of create that balance between the applied theoretical nature of science and the applied practical nature of the practitioners, the people in the field that are working with athletes. And often what you see is what happens in the field is a translation of the theory, or it's a complete trial and error or test, retest approach in the field. So a classic example of that could be if you have an endurance runner, and I can see we've got someone on the call who I know very well, who's a very good endurance athlete. If they only read one thing, which was, okay, here's a guideline, you need to consume between 7 and 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilo as per the kind of guidelines, that's correct in the context um, of glycogen loading, for example, but then we need to contextualize it in the context of that individual. And they may not necessarily have to go that high to get the same performance effects. So it's looking at the individualized nature of nutrition as well. So as part of that, Ian and I we spent a lot of time really exploring who are the kind of key people we wanted in this book, particularly the practitioners, because they were the ones that, in my opinion, brought a lot of magic to the book, because the academics had a very not fixed approach, but a very robust approach to looking at the literature. But the practitioners, I felt, were the ones that helped bring it to life a little bit. And it's finding that magic in the middle.
That's your phrase, magic in the middle. And we found some really interesting interactions between academics and practitioners. And I think in some cases, a little bit of friction at first when one believes this and the other believes something else. But when they actually start talking, so communication's a big part of integrative working, especially when you get people from different backgrounds.
Yeah, and it's also worth adding that we're not dismissing either or party. We're trying to find the blend between it. So, I'll give you an example. I have a colleague who's a practitioner, also an academic, um, was interested in finding out whether certain sports related products could be done naturally, could be consumed naturally. And of course they can. But then if you're only thinking about it from a supplement or a theoretical perspective, you might only consume a particular brand or a particular commercial product. But as you'll see in the book, and at the end of the book, we have a really good chapter that ironically has been trialed and tested. But some of the natural recipes that Ian and his wife came up with and the team came up with, um, are natural versions of things like sports drinks and recovery bars and gummies and stuff like that, which I'd encourage you all to try. They're very interesting.
And very colourful. So Justin's doing a lot of research into polyphenols, especially with his PhD student, and polyphenols come from colour in nature. So when you can get that into real, what I call DIY sports drinks and bars and recovery formulas, you're giving nutrition to the body. You contrast that with the same amount of carbs in, let's say, a commercial sports drink that has colours, flavours, sweeteners, preservatives sometimes. The body has to clear that out. and that takes a lot of vital energy, a lot of ATP. And in a way, you're actually using energy to gain that energy, which sounds a bit of a complex one, but there's an element there.
And just to build on that, one thing you did ask, Ian, was kind of what else have we kind of covered in the book? And I think a fundamental parameter of this book is the strap line on the title, which is a health feeds performance perspective. So we're coming at this very much from lessons and experiences that both Ian and I have had over the years, decades, where we've looked at athletes that have performed very well by addressing the health of their body and addressing the quality of their nutrition instead of just focusing on performance. And yet, in a performance domain, the word performance is everything. So it's kind of trying to get that knowledge across, or that thinking across, that if we focused on the individual, focused on their health, focused on the quality of their nutrition, the performance should come. And that's part of it as well.
Okay, let's share some slides, I think. So most of what we're sharing here are figures from chapter 1. And chapter 1's obviously setting the scene. So this is an old spiders diagram from IFM in the 1990s, which we've used in a slightly different way to just represent the integration of the body systems. So this one diagram is pretty much the first section, or the first half of the textbook, going into gut, immune, endocrine, nervous system, musculoskeletal, detoxification, energy pathways, cardiovascular system, etc. And then we've got this, which we created for the actual textbook. So I like the COGS kind of concept of, if you had an old watch, i.e. not these new digital things, like the watch I have from my grandfather, if you took all the cogs apart and laid them on the table, it's still the same watch, but it doesn't work anymore. So there's an integration of all those cogs that make it timely. And the old timepieces would keep almost exact time. Think of Big Ben or something. So you need all these body systems in good health, cross-linking with one another, which is what I'm always asking my students to think about. How do we cross-link? How do we relate one symptom to a completely different one to find a strategy to support that person? And then around that, you've got all the elements of all the controllables that you can bring into the person's strategy, apart from the genetics, that is. So I always describe genetics as like one of your hands, but your other hand is all these other things on this diagram, and you shake hands and that's what you get. That's your phenotype or your expression. So we can impact all of those things. And here's another use of the word integrative. If you're a nutrition practitioner, you'll do a lot of this up at the top. If you're an exercise practitioner, you'll do a lot of this down at the bottom. But the person needs all of them in good coordination and balance in order to take the person forward. And I'm just going to take you onto the next slide and hand over the baton to Justin. So in chapter 1, Justin created these discussions around layers of this pyramid, which is the thinking that we as practitioners should be doing with our clients.
Yeah, it might be good actually, even if you just put all 5 layers on, because I think it's I wanted to start with layer 5 actually.
Okay, right.
So
Sorry, I've gone in the wrong direction.
Gone in the wrong way. There you go. So we've got this pyramid, which is kind of an adaptation of other pyramids. There are other tools like this where they talk very much about the hierarchy of nutrition. And I just wanted to start with the last one first, which is layer 5, the athlete's story, because I think even though we can talk about nutrition from a quality and quantity perspective, I think that one of not necessarily the starting point, but a good all-round aspect is to consider the athlete as an individual. So the athlete's story, which we'll come on to. But the pyramid we've got in our integrative model, which kind of drives our thinking, starts off with, you've probably heard this expression, a food first approach, a quality nutrition approach. And the reason we decided to put that right at the bottom as a foundation is because I actually can't think of a time when an athlete's come in to see me or in the past when they've seen me and they focused on quality of their diet instead of their quantity of the diet. And they've all come in and really it's about the fuel, it's about the amount of carbohydrates, the amount of proteins, etc., that they're focused on, and not necessarily the type or the quality. So this foundation level is really based on this kind of whole food first approach, not dismissing other strategies such as supplements or ergogenic aids, but really the diet you're consuming and how that underpins your health and therefore your performance. So this is where we focus on things like nutritional quality, nutrient density, and enhancing the overall dietary value to the athlete. And then if they get that in place, they've probably done a big chunk of this textbook, by the way. But then you then layer it up into the second part of the pyramid. We've got this integrative nutrition for health, and that's the cogs diagram that you just saw in the previous slide. So this is where we talk about integrative health, where you're thinking about how do each of the systems of the body interact. And for example, if you start to impact on one area like the gut, how does that impact on things like muscle or even the immune system? So it's kind of getting you to think about the interaction between systems. And as you go through section one of the book, we start to really play on some of these crosstalks. And where the science is going, by the way, as many of you will know, is this kind of crosstalk between the gut, the brain, the gut, the mitochondria, the gut, the muscle, the gut, the immune. So there's this crosstalk both from the gut and back to the gut as well. So we're starting to learn more about how the quality of the diet impacts some of the signaling molecules from the gut to other tissues and how they impact. And I think that's something for the near future. And then we get into stage three, which is the classical applied nutrition layer. This is really not to dismiss the kind of, countless decades of research that has preceded this textbook, and it certainly doesn't dismiss any of the standpoints and position stands around the amounts of fuels that we might need for performance, particularly if we consider the macronutrients, but we shouldn't also forget about the micronutrients. And if you read the book, particularly I think it's the second section, we've deliberately focused on the micronutrients before the macronutrients. For that reason, we want to really emphasize the quality of the diet as much as the quantity of the diet. And so, this is really where the current sports nutrition guidelines come in, but we are underpinning that with this integrative approach. And then you've got layer four, which is your nutritional ergogenics. So in the real world, there's only really a handful of ergogenics that have been demonstrated to have considerable performance benefits. The obvious ones being things like caffeine and creatine and bicarbonate. But there are others. And so we kind of explore some of those ergogenics throughout the book. But this book is not about specifically targeting sports supplements, but they come into this part as potentially the quote unquote icing on the cake. And also within that, we talk a lot throughout the book. If you're a high level athlete, being aware of, things like batch contamination or informed sport testing, etc. So the important thing here is to think about the contextualization of the sports supplements within the context of both the diet and the sport. And then the final one is this athlete's story, which we mentioned at the beginning. I know that Paul's online because he's very much part of this book as one of the authors. But this is really looking at the kind of the overall athlete story, what they do. We've got an athlete, or we've got probably a couple of athletes on the call, but I know one in particular. You look at their lifestyle, you look at what environment they live in, you look at their daily behaviors and maybe their stress load or family demands or their social considerations, their life load. All of these will have an impact on not only their nutritional needs, but also their stress levels, which can impact their system as well. So if you've ever had a period of time where you've not slept very well, you'll know exactly what I mean. So it's really about trying to think about these different layers and how you bring it all together to maximize the benefits for the individual.
Okay, it's still your turn. So we're going into the science of this and the the application of science to practice. And this is one of the benefits of being a scientist and being in science, is being able to read the science and know what's relevant in what context. And that's important. But for many of us lay people, and I'll include myself in terms of I'm a practitioner looking at research, not necessarily through a science lens. And then there's the risk of applying something that you think can be generalized out, but it's actually done within a small subset of individuals. And the context, we use the word context an awful lot. The contextualization of information is vital, because you have an N of 1 in front of you, and that's who you need to apply this information to. So Justin's going to talk us through 3 different graphs of the same kind of scientific information, but the kind of information morphs a little bit as he goes through and gets into more detail. All right, over to you.
Yeah, so I think I'd start off by saying 2 things. One, we must never dismiss scientific-based evidence. We haven't got this far in sports nutrition by just dismissing science. So the science is a robust part of our understanding and contributes to our a reductionist approach to understanding specific answers to specific questions. And to do that, if you've been into the lab I've worked in, you'll know that we bring in many people to do studies, and from that we then base our observations. So you're looking at a cohort of people and the means and standard deviations around that. What I found is that for many practitioners I've spoken to, often they're time restricted. So what they will do is either pick on 1 or 2 papers, or they'll maybe look at an abstract, and they're basing their judgment around quick decisions, which is okay on one side, but it's not okay if you're delving into the science. So as an example, this is just a hypothetical figure here, but it represents the figure you might see in a meta-analysis. And if you don't know what specifically a meta-analysis is, it's where researchers have looked at data from a collection of studies and try to pull the effect sizes or the kind of the spread of information from those papers to compare them in some manner. So in this case here, let's just say we're looking at the effect of a supplement on strength performance for the sake of argument. And you can see there's 10 studies here, and they've all found different things, and they've all got different variances between them. And then at the end there, where it's got the mean, it suggests that overall these studies favor a supplement, which on first appearance they do. But then if you look at the spread within that mean and standard deviation, you can see that it crosses the effect size of 0, which basically suggests it's not as clear cut as that. There could be an effect, but it's probably not significant. And so one of the things that I always encourage people is 2 things. One is to read widely and always have a balanced view on a particular research area, because there's always going to be positives and negatives. You're always going to find some papers that work and some papers that show there isn't an effect. And in the actual first chapter, we do have 2 links to 2 papers where we're not promoting or criticizing the papers. One is just to show that if you only read paper 1, you would have a particular view on a supplement. If you read only paper 2, you would have a completely different view on a particular supplement. By reading both, you get a more balanced approach. And this is why reading widely and also broadly across disciplines is also kind of important. So the first one is meta-analyses are kind of typically referred to as gold standard, or they have a very high status in terms of the research quality. But we should also be mindful of what the results are showing us. And I've seen plenty of examples where, and at conferences where authors or practitioners have put up slides like this, and they've just said, oh, it clearly shows an effect. And we're looking at the actual mean data and thinking, does it? Is it statistically significant or not? So if you then picked on a particular study, if we go to the next slide, let's just say this is one of those studies where it shows there was a clear performance benefit of taking a particular supplement on strength. So on the left-hand side in the white bars, we've got the placebo before and after supplementation, or before and after an intervention. And on the dark bars, we've got the supplement. And you can see the little star above the post-supplement suggests that there's a significant difference in the supplement compared to the placebo. That's good, because that's looking at the overall mean of that group, and you can see the spread of data between the different people, and you can see there is a significant translation from that research. But if you go to the next slide, if we've got the individual data from the same study, we could start to see who's responding and who's not. Because if I give a particular supplement to 20 people, you might find a percentage of them may improve, a percentage of them may not improve, and a percentage of them might actually get worse. So we need to also consider what's happening on an individual level, because one of my very first research studies was looking at a particular sports drink. And this one stands out in my mind because I remember there was one individual on the study who had never taken these particular products before and had an amazing response to them. In fact, he went out and won his next few races. So for him, that particular supplement was beneficial in the context of his overall pattern, and he was a potential outlier of the group because he responded very differently, like you see on the right-hand side of this graph, where we've got 3 people who have a massive improvement in their strength. But equally so, within that group, we have 3 people that actually get worse, and we have a few people that kind of stay the same. So I think it's also important to be mindful of not only the bigger picture, the meta-analysis. It's worth having an understanding of what the papers are trying to teach us or suggest to us, and also what's going on at an individual level if the authors share that data. And that also then comes back to this idea of individualized approaches. So in this case here, if you just highlight the top part of the supplement with the person that's increased the most, let's assume this is person 1. And then if you look at the person right at the bottom who only improves a little bit, it could be that we've got 2 individuals. For some reason, the strength of the individual number 2 who didn't respond very well, it may be they didn't respond to that particular supplement, whereas individual 1 for some reason did. And from a science perspective, it could be interesting to explore why. Why have we got someone who's potentially a responder and someone who's potentially not a responder, whilst taking into consideration the overall effect within the group? And this then translates back into the field. So if you then look at what athletes do in the real world, often they will trial and error or experiment, if you like, with their strategies to enhance both their training and their performance. And of course, most athletes, as far as I'm aware, don't train or operate in a controlled laboratory environment. And so we have to also consider, how do we translate the science from a lab into the real world practice that occurs in the field?
And I'm just going to use this this slide to extend that out a little bit, because Justin's just been talking about that research evidence and how it has to be individualized, contextualized to that person you're working with, because you as the practitioner should be using this research information, but you need to use it in conjunction with other circles. And if you've been practicing as long as I have, you've got quite a lot of experience, and you start tuning into patterns that you've picked up on previous cases that might have similarities, and it might get you to a successful strategy a little bit quicker, at the same time as observing scientific changes and using that evidence-based research. So the term evidence-based research is an important one now. Whenever I put on courses and go for BANT accreditation or any accreditation, I need to show that it's evidence-based research. In other words, every slide's got some science behind it. So there's the practitioner experience, and we need to be listening. You know, we have 2 of these and 1 of these, so we need to be learning as much as we can from the client. And I'll give you a very quick example. If it's a body composition type scenario, they're trying to maybe lose some body fat, a very good question is, well, have you tried to, change your body composition before? And if so, what has worked well? And then you're tapping into the athlete or the person's experience. You bring in your experience, and then there might be some new evidence on keto diets or other types of diets, and then you might have a few clues on how to start. So it's like being a detective. And then overall, you bring those facets together and hopefully you improve the health and performance of your client. Okay, right, we're going to do two case scenarios. We're going to finish with these case studies. I'll then tell you how you can get more info in the book, and then we'll open for some questions. So I'm just going to talk through these two cases and then task Justin to come up with some thoughts around, well, what would he start with? And then I'll throw in my ideas as well. So both of these athletes are looking to participate in an Olympic triathlon event. This one just aims to finish and the next one wants to be competitive. Okay, so here's a 45-year-old recreational triathlete. He trains 3 times a week, including 1 long run at the weekend. BMI's in the overweight category. Work stress and travel time are both high. He has health symptoms of fatigue, low energy during training, feeling sluggish between training, and experiencing regular digestive complaints, mostly stomach cramps, not seemingly related to the training. He's got a pretty high glycemic carbohydrate dominant diet with lots of ultra processed foods, cravings in the afternoon for coffee and sweets during his afternoon dip, and his caloric intake generally exceeds 3,000 calories per day. Case scenario 2, slightly younger, 33-year-old club level triathlete who wants to basically beat his club rival. Trains 5 times a week, including 2 long distance sessions. BMI in the normal range. He's working part-time, but he's got health symptoms of insomnia, afternoon malaise, several bouts of flu-like symptoms recently, which have affected his training, and gut cramps immediately after longer sessions. He's got a pescatarian diet with carbohydrates at about 40% of overall intake, largely sourced from root veg, wholemeal pasta and brown rice. So he's a little bit more mindful about his food consumption than case 1. Drinks about 3 litres of water per day, occasional herbal teas, and then doesn't have any coffee. And the caloric intake is fairly similar to case 1. So, Justin, you've just consulted with both of these people. Where are you going to start? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think the first thing to point out is these are very typical case studies. Whilst we have picked 2 kind of generic cases here, they are typically reflective of many people we've seen in the past. So on the one hand, you've got a lower level athlete, shall we say, someone who's more recreational, and then you've got someone who's more competitive here. The striking thing that leaps out to me straight away is the fact that if you only stuck to the general guidelines around macro intake, they're probably very close, or if not above, where they need to be, particularly the first one. But then if you delve a little bit deeper, you can see that go back to our pyramid, you can see that the nutrition quality of one clearly needs addressing, and maybe that's a good starting point. But I would also want to know a little bit more information. For example, what else, we're only looking at a snapshot of their diet. Do we have enough information to make educated decisions? What about their training, non-training days? So what are they doing outside of training? What's their story around their lifestyle like? Have we got enough information to understand why they're experiencing some of these symptoms? And also, are there any symptoms where we might need more information or we might need to refer on? So we need to be a bit mindful of the bigger picture here. You could argue that both of them are generally healthy. You could also argue that the BMI of the first case is on the higher side, and have they got a secondary goal not only to finish a race but also lose weight in the process? So I think we need to look at a number of levels of questions and deeper analysis of this individual, whilst then considering how they fit into the pyramid in terms of quality, integration, quantity, and then only then would I then start thinking about what else they might need in terms of supplements. I'd also be intrigued to find out what they're doing during their training and what are they doing during their events in terms of supplementation as well. Would you add to that?
Yeah, just add a few perceptions. So just my instinct. It was you that came up with these cases in the chapter. So my instinct, if I had these kind of people coming to me, is case scenario one, we can do a huge amount by working on dietary changes, regular ultra processed food consumption. You can, just improve the quality. And without changing the caloric intake, you can start dropping the BMI by lowering the insulin load, lowering the load on his detoxification systems, starting to balance out hormones better. The work stress is a big one. So starting to tap into stress management techniques and things that he can bring into his lifestyle, potentially pre-bed. Sleep wasn't an issue for this one, but we need to capitalize on the time when he's not working and training to recuperate, as you said. With case two, so in other words, case one, probably some quite basic stuff could get you a long way. Case two, there's a bit more going on because the diet's already much, much better, although I always use the microscope and go into, well, this is what he's reporting, but, is it actually as good as he's reporting? And you will often find stuff creeping in that's perceived by a layperson to be high quality or good food, or it might be a trend that he's following, but he's just not got the digestive capability of processing it well. He might be on fancy smoothies, but his gut's rejecting it because it's too complex. You might need to back up to some digestive strategies to just get him digesting his food better. And then by digesting better, the caloric intake may not need to go any higher. You can start actually, this fatigue is an important aspect. But of course, insomnia, so balancing blood sugar is really important, but also start to address, well, what's keeping him up at night? If he's only working part-time, are there other types of stressors in his life that you need to address or start to look at or be aware of? He might have just had a big relationship breakup, or there might be financial stress, or he might be really taking it seriously, this competition coming up, and it's creating anxiety. So there might be some genetic or family tendencies towards anxiety, and you need to work more on that. So bring in a bit of yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong or something balancing. So I talk about yin yang in one of the chapters. So there's a lot of different things, because on the surface this guy looks a lot healthier than the other guy, but symptomatically that's not the case. So how do you unpack the digestion? And I've seen several clients like this in the past where they're actually eating well, but their guts in horrendous state, and then you do a stool test and nothing much is coming out of that, and then you start really working on their anxiety and their stress levels and strategies, and then you make some progress. So there's different layers in this one from the first one to me. Okay, our last slide. So Justin, do you want to quickly talk us through this in terms of, this is in chapter 17 of the book. So it's kind of our, what do you do with the book chapter? So do you want to give us a quick run through there?
Yeah, we wanted to come up with a kind of like flow map that kind of helped people make decisions when reading the book. So, for example, if you're, as you just highlighted at the very beginning there, understanding the athlete's story, and it's another reason why I wanted to start with layer 5 of the pyramid first. So you really get to understand the person. I think within that, you might also do background research. So reading chapter 1 and becoming aware of personalized approaches to nutrition, which is chapter 2, would fall into that early part. And we've just got a note in red at the side there that when you're making decisions and looking at the evidence, do it from a balanced perspective, a critical perspective, and a translational perspective, not just what I've heard many, many, many times, which is, oh, a paper showed this. Yeah, but what does the rest of the paper show, and what's the overall picture? And then when you're addressing underlying balances, when we did this, we kind of looked at the imbalances versus the gut as being two primary areas where we felt you could probably make the biggest difference, or at least certainly get the momentum rolling. And this is where chapters 2 to 8, and particularly chapter 3, come in from a gut perspective. And this is where also changing the dietary quality as well as the macro balance start to impact some of these imbalances and functionalities. And then you've got the layer beneath that, which is the interaction between nutrition for energy, nutrition for muscle and bone, and nutrition for immune tolerance and detoxification. And these are where some of the other chapters, particularly in the second part of the book, chapters 14 to 16, for example, come into play. And then bring it together. We put performance at the end. If you've noticed, what we've done up to that point is focus on more the health of the individual and the training of the individual. And then you get to the actual performance perspective where pretty much the whole book comes into this, but you can start to think about things like personalized nutrition, injury management, avoidance of relative energy deficiency in sport, and also how to monitor individuals. And then, of course, the final layer, which is hydration, sports drinks, and ergogenics. So what we feel is that this gives the reader a kind of opportunity to dip in and out of the book to support their current activities.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, so this is where you can actually get more information. So this is our website, intsportsnutrition.com. You just click on this new textbook tab. The green button takes you to an overview of the book. It's got the synopsis, it's got all the chapters, and it's got our information and then all the contributors. And then it's got a chapter list which you can click through and get more information on each chapter. So all the abstracts for the chapters are there, plus some like figures we've used tonight. You can download image files of these figures if you want to use them as PDFs. We just ask that you don't change them and you keep that copyright to the textbook on the actual slide. On the right hand side, the purchase button takes you through to the Routledge publisher's website, so that's directly to purchase a book. And they've literally just given us a 25% discount code, which runs up until the start of December. So use this code ISEN25 when you go through the checkout if you want to do that. All right. And then final slide is just our contact details. So I'm going to stop share and open for questions. So everyone online, what would you like to quiz us with?
Sorry about this, Ian, but you might not be surprised to hear I've got one or two questions to throw at you. So absolutely no change there. First of all, a comment just on what you've been talking about. I'd love to have another one of these on reading research papers, because the thing is a minefield for all the reasons that Justin actually mentioned. And you can look at the easy things like the cohort that they've actually used, whether the authors have got any conflict in, etc., etc. But when you start digging down into the detail and the actual stats used and relative risk as opposed to actual risk and things like that, I think there's very few practitioners out there who actually understand. And with meta-analysis, the way they can be skewed by different papers that they've used and the size of those papers and the quality of the papers brought in. So it'd be really, really interesting. Just as something else to put on your to-do list, Ian, I, for one, would really appreciate another one of these of digging down, particularly into Justin's brain. It's one of these 2 glasses of red wine over a meal type discussions that I'd love to have. Anyway, questions. First of all is the obvious one, and then there's a number of others which are sort of interconnected, but who is the actual intended audience for the book? Where did you see, what was your vision of the people, of the vision who would actually take the book up?
That's a fantastic question. Do you want me to take this one, Ian?
Yeah, go for it.
I think we actually had this at the very beginning of the book, where we were going, okay, so who's it for? Is it for the athlete? Is it for the coach? Is it for the practitioner? Is it for the academic? Is it for someone interested in sports nutrition that's working in a different field. And it's kind of all of that. And I think most importantly, I would say it's probably primarily for the academic and practitioner, but with the athlete in mind. So it's kind of everybody, but I could see an academic reading this from a theoretical interest. I could see a practitioner reading this from a how do I apply this interest. But most importantly, I could see the individual athlete learning and gaining from aspects of the book as well. So it's all of them.
Okay, great. And then a lot of the others are sort of like interconnected, and really this is sort of your personal experience or feelings. I'll be really interested to hear on the areas of research as you've gone through them through the book that you had the most confidence in and the least confidence in. So something that's been hanging around, let's take sliding filament theory. Been around since the 50s. No one has ever argued with the validity of that research. You could go right to the other extreme where you had the classic 2006 paper on amyloid, beta amyloid, which actually got retracted. So I'd be interested to hear if there are sort of outliers in your thoughts. And also, when you've been going through the book, have you actually changed your opinion at all on any areas of research that you held before that you don't hold now? And then last one, promise, what are the areas, A, that you're most excited about in nutritional research at the moment? And what are the areas that frustrate you most?
Wow, three fantastic questions. And for those that don't know, Paul's one of the contributors to the book, and they are brilliant questions. Well done. And Paul's one of these people that's really thought-provoking. So that's really got me thinking. I don't know where to start with this one. I think from the research perspective, I'll try and answer one and two at the same time. But there are certain chapters in the book that are fundamental, like the musculoskeletal and injury chapter. That's based on very structured physiological domains, and some of the nutrition in that is also kind of novel, and it's on the cusp of where the science is as well, where we're going with the science. Then you've got other chapters that for me were quite enlightening. I'm not a detox specialist at all, and when I read through that chapter as an editor and kind of spoke to some of the people writing it, I gained an awful lot from that as well, and realized just how much that goes into the whole system of detoxification. So there are various chapters where there's a lot of physiology. There's a lot of physiology in the book, by the way, but I think the muscle chapters I'm probably more comfortable with. The detox chapters I learned an awful lot from, and I can see that's an area that's very underappreciated in sport nutrition as well. And then from a kind of the last question was about where do I see it going, correct?
Yep.
So I think in chapter, I think it's chapter 2, we talk about personalized nutrition, and we also talk about genetics as well. And I see this as being an area that will probably unfold more dramatically in the coming decade. I don't see it being a kind of prescription tool in the sense of take this test, you will suddenly be able to perform better. I see it as a monitoring or kind of support structure to understanding individual requirements. And I can see that growing as a big field. Polyphenols, I see that as a huge area. There's a part of the chapter where we've really kind of gone into the niche of polyphenols, and I see that whole area of phytonutrition really expanding into the performance domain. And the more we understand about how these particular nutrients interact with the gut and the various body systems, I think that will unfold. I think other areas like the detoxification will probably become more in the mainstream awareness. Certainly, I think there's a section where we also talk about autoimmunity, and that's becoming more prevalent in sport. And then there was a section right towards the end of the book where we talked a little bit about nutrient timing. And whilst there is a degree of controversy around nutrient timing, there's also kind of a lot of practicalities within nutrient timing. So I could see that being another area that kind of carries on unfolding with time as well.
I think the nuances will develop a little bit more. from my perspective, we're in this era of almost like fads. It's like people running down this route at top speed to try and prove that this, in some cases, extreme approach is the way to go. You know, lots of research behind that. And then you get people almost doing opposite things, like the carb-fat domain, and they'll call each other names. But over time, I think this personalization will come in so that we find the nuance and the balance between these scientific altered views and things like, you know, all the things Justin's mentioned, like detoxification. It's almost like a four-letter word at the moment in medicine, but the basis is it's a physiological system. And when we went through that chapter with Catherine, who's online at the moment, and Heidi, who were the major contributors to that chapter, there was a lot of science. It's a huge amount of science in that area, but it's just not accepted yet. Your average doctor, your average researcher kind of poo-poos it. And that was actually a sticking point getting it past the publishers at the start, but thankfully they were open-minded enough. So I see nuances being developed, the personalization. I see researchers getting a little bit more comfortable with, well, I don't actually know. It might be more developing into the N=1 space. Maybe we might even see research type. You know, we're also in the era of double-blind placebo-controlled trials being gold standards. But they're very kind of fixed in the way they work, so there might be a little bit more adaptability, especially with the AI, because AI can cope with complexity, whereas old-fashioned statistics is a bit more linear. So yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting couple of decades ahead of us.
Just to add to that, and also building on the question that Scott put in the chat, I think one of the challenges with writing this book is we had at least one other book in our original discussion, so we could have written two books here. We just didn't have the time or the inclination. But you know, there's a lot of material. We haven't gone into very specific supplements, for example, when this is not a supplement book. And I love the question, how do you keep, you know, when you've got so much complexity in the arena, how do you keep it applied for the athlete, and at least keep it athlete friendly? I think that's a really good point, Scott. And I think maybe that's the next book, which is how do we translate some of this to how we apply it in the real world by having more case studies or having more kind of sport-related examples. And maybe that's something we will consider if we do write another book. But to answer the question, I think it starts with working with the individual as an N=1. And I think that's the key point we're trying to make. We're not trying to dismiss any previous theories or science or other people's opinions or views. We're just trying to simply say that if we look at this domain of sports nutrition, is there a new way of thinking around this integration of the foods and also what it's doing for the body? And within that, it then comes down to an N=1. And I should also mention that the person that was kindly did the forward for the book, Professor Graham Close, he's written a very good paper on this where he talks about from paper to podium. And he talks very much about this kind of looking at the application in the real world and how do you keep things simple. And from my own experience of working with athletes, you have to keep it simple. And that's not to dismiss them. It's more they've got to do it on a day-to-day basis whilst doing everything else. And for them, the training often is much more important. So you have to make the nutrition easy, manageable, tasty. That's a really key point, because if it doesn't taste good, they're not going to do it for very long. But most importantly, enjoyable. And we do mention that in the book, by the way. And at the very end of the book, this is why Ian and Rachel have done a fantastic job bringing together some really cool recipes that could be trialed as part of your training, and they're natural. So it's you know, it's really coming at this from an applied perspective. But I think the key thing is to understand the goal of the individual, to understand the lifestyle and demands of that individual, and to come up with a practical plan that is effectively monitored. I wouldn't call it trial and error. I'd call it test it, monitor it, evaluate. So it's almost like moving forward with the person in mind. And anyone that's done any competitive sport, and I know there's a few people on the call that have, you'll know that you don't have a one size fits all diet. You're always changing, you're always monitoring, you're always trying to subtly adapt your diet to suit your needs. So I think it's a journey, and it's a flexible journey.
Wise words. I'm just picking up Aisha's question. What advice would you give to those working in team sports where individualization is difficult? And that's a key one. Some teams, especially the kind of the more rich, bigger clubs with a budget, might be able to individualize. So you might have a nutritionist who can work one-on-one with individuals, but often it's working with the whole team. And, you were talking about Graham Close. That's something he did with England rugby for a long time. So ultimately, we need to personalize this information for people, but there's some basics. And the real basics, I get inspiration by looking back in time. What did our ancestors eat? Well, they didn't eat all this crap that we have in our food chain nowadays. We need to get back to basics. And how do we make real food tasty? So Justin was talking about the last chapter with my wife Rachel. I'll give her the credit for the recipes because that's her domain. She has this capacity to take, obviously she sources food, really good quality food, and you can taste the difference. Like a carrot from the local organic farm versus a carrot that's traveled halfway around the world. Still organic, but it's got no taste in it. So sourcing the ingredients and then preparing it in a certain way. So if you're working with a sports team, how do you work with the chefs? How do you work with the families to improve the food sourcing, number one, and the food preparation, number two, still keeping it relatively cost effective because real food shouldn't be that expensive. It can be, depending on where you shop. And then really deeply nourishing and making it practical. So I love smoothies, I love DIY sports drinks, love making it fun. So it has to, Graham Close says this as well, it has to taste really good. Otherwise they'll take it for a bit and then it will go out of their palate and they'll pick up that commercial drink that they can grab at the garage as they drive to practice. It has to taste good. And then they'll keep coming back to it. They keep asking for it.
Just a couple more. Just to add to that, I mean, I was very privileged to see one of Graham's conference presentations. Very good. And if you know Graham, he's worked with some very high-profile individuals. And one of the slides, he had a picture of an athlete who had just finished a match. I don't think they won, so they were not in festive moods. And in one hand, he's holding a protein shake, and the other hand, he's holding a beer. And the question was, what's working? So you also have to contextualize things. So in the short term, you have to contextualize it. But in the long term, for me, the diet is about, if someone said to me, what's more important, the training or the diet? That's a good question because I think you need both. And I'd probably argue that without the nutrition, you can't train very well. But for me, the diet is more about the longer term. If you're doing a training program, you don't do it for 2 days. You do it for 2 months, 2 years, whatever. So it's the long-term effect. And from that perspective, it's got to be sustainable. It's got to be enjoyable. Otherwise, you're going to go through more kind of fad type approaches to your diet, and you're going to have more kind of peaks and troughs in your approaches. So this comes back to the question that Aisha asked, which is, what advice would you give? I'm going to put Ian on the spot here. What would you give to those working in team sports where individualization is difficult? Good question.
Well, that's the one I just tried to approach with. You might not have an individual, but there's some real basics, in getting the food quality and the food preparation and the education. And get them off Twitter or X or TikTok and get them off the fads. Just get them really grounded with real food. But that's easier said than done. You've worked in football, Justin. I've got students who work with football, and yeah, it's notoriously very difficult. So some of the stuff is really basic, maybe even forget the food quality, but just get it in, get your lunch in because you're coming to practice at 4 in the afternoon with enough energy. So there's some real basics that apply across the board. And if you have the ability, you can get into a bit of individualization if the budget is there to then do that.
Yeah, and just to add to that from Aisha's perspective, one of the things I found was don't try and do everything. So if you're working with someone who's already a high level athlete or in a competitive arena, they already have a lot of the basics in place in terms of their training. And for them, it's like almost kind of a slowly approach. And always used to find that it's, if you went in and tried to move the truck to the left, it's not going to happen. But if you just try to just do one or two things slowly, it's more practical and they're probably more likely going to do it. But the education is the key, but gradually. I also found that it was kind of useful to talk about it in the context of their language. So if they're talking about winning matches or their return to training or sleeping as well as all the other people in the team or, whatever it was, training as hard as the other people in the team, turn it around so you're focusing on their goals in the context of the wider team performance. But most importantly, I found it was about understanding their lifestyle, their patterns. So for example, some of them were moving around a lot. So for them, it was like coming up with practical suggestions that they could do en route to a match or on the bus back home or something like that. Or it was about how do I fuel myself between training sessions when I'm on the move, and that's where it became more individualized and more personalized. So I think it is about working with the individual on a one-to-one basis, but you also kind of appreciating the wider context of the team. And the second question from Aisha was about, does the book cover genetic predispositions which can affect training programs or training plans?
I would say no. We do talk about genetics that are known so far around training. But there's a very important thing. When you've got an athlete who's figured out what they're good at, don't try and persuade them otherwise because their genetics maybe says something different. I've seen the genetics of top rugby players who have amazing endurance genes apparently, and I've seen genetics of top South African trail runners, one of which, he's got quite a famous name, who had incredibly powered genetics but not brilliant endurance. And it's like, okay, how does that work? So number one, genetic science is evolving. When you get it's up to the discernment of a laboratory to put together a panel of SNPs. It doesn't represent everything physiologically going on in that person's body. So you have to bring in genetic information in the context of the bigger picture. So I don't know if there'll ever be a book that will cover genetics and training needs in totality, but I think as it's one of these scientific evolvements that I think we'll get more and more close to understanding attributes of an athlete that are either positive or negative that can be used to influence training plans, dietary plans, lifestyle aspects. Okay, so I think that's all the questions, and thanks for them because it got us tasked, especially Justin. I'm glad you were here for the science questions from Paul. So yeah, go and buy the book, give us some comments, and please interact with us as well, because this is about an ongoing process. It's not just getting a book out that you read. It's about trying to inform practice. It's about slowly changing the face of how we do sports and nutrition. Any last comments from you, Justin?
Thanks for your time, everyone, and also those watching afterwards. And if you've got any feedback for us as well, either about the book or anything that is positive or constructive that we could improve in the future, because there will be an addition to at some point, I'm sure. Always good to hear. But yeah, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the book.